Welcome to another hands-on lesson. What we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to test routing policies with Amazon Route 53. So let's head over to AWS and start looking at Route 53. So I'm logged in. Now I'm actually logged into a different account than we've been using. And the reason for that is because I already have a hosted zone, but I'm going to show you now what to do if you don't have one and you want to create one. Now it does cost a bit of money, so it's up to you whether you do that. If you don't have a hosted zone, then you can just sort of watch me through this particular lab and see how I set things up. Now, what I'm going to do is go to Route 53, and in Route 53, if I go to hosted zones, you'll see I have this hosted zone here called dctlabs.com. That's a public domain name that I can use. Now, if you want to register your own domain name so you can follow on with this lab, then you can go to Register Domains, click on Register Domain, and then you would search for your domain name here. So let's say you wanted to put in the domain name AWS Student. You would then click on Check, and it's very unlikely you'd get the .com for that, but you might find that there's something else like awsstudent.net. So this is just an example. You would then add it to cart, and you've got to fill out some information, and then you can buy that domain name, and that gives you access to that domain name for 1 year. So up to you if you do it. We are only using it for this particular lab in this course, so it's not that important. If you do quite a few of my other courses, you'll find that I actually use domain names like this in multiple courses, so it is worth having one. But I'm just going to cancel out of there because I'm going to use the one that I already have. So I come back to hosted zones, and this is where I can actually modify my zone and add some records into it. Now, when you go into a hosted zone, it will always have the name server record. This points to AWS's name servers, and then it has a start of authority and SOA record as well. So those two should always be in there. Don't delete those. And then we can create our own records. Now, before we do that, we're going to set up our endpoints. What we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of web servers. One for me is going to be in Sydney. So what I suggest is you choose one that's close to you. So create a web server that's close to wherever you are physically. And then I'm going to create one on the other side of the world, which is US East North Virginia for me. So once I've got those two web servers, we can then test what happens using a latency-based routing policy if I try to connect from my machine here to the endpoint, the domain name dctlabs.com. And then we'll also create another EC2 instance somewhere else in the world that's closer to our distant endpoint, and that will give us a way to actually test what happens if you connect from there, and it should be a different result. Now, what we need to do next is just get some data which we're going to use for our user data for our instances. So we're going to copy this code to our clipboard, and we're going to use this to actually populate the web server with a web page with some information on it. It's going to actually tell us which availability zone the instance is located in. So that will help us work out where in the world it actually is. Now, this relies on two pieces of information. Firstly, we need to copy this user data. Now, you'll have a download. When you get the course download, open up the code directory, go into Route 53, and you'll find user data route53.sh. Now, this file has the user data. There's also an index.txt file in the same folder. You need to upload that to an S3 bucket, and your S3 bucket is going to be different to mine. Mine's called DCT Labs. Yours is going to be different. So what you need to do, upload the index.txt file to an S3 bucket, and then put in the name of the S3 bucket here. So replace DCT Labs. Once you've done that, copy the code, and we'll head over to EC2. In EC2, we're going to launch an instance somewhere that's close to us. So for me, Sydney is the closest region. So I'm going to launch an instance. As always, it will be a Linux 2 AMI and a T2 Micro. Now, I don't care which availability zone or which VPC this is in, so I'm just going to leave the defaults. Now, I do need to access S3, so I need to change this role to S3 read only. And that will give me the ability to read that file from the S3 bucket. And now I can paste this code in. So this code will actually install a web service, and it will then copy that index.txt file to the web server, and it will then use this curl command to pull information from the metadata on the EC2 instance about which availability zone it is, and then it outputs it into the file. So let's click forward, go to security groups, select an existing security group. I'm going to choose this one here, and then let's launch this instance. So that one's coming up. I'm now going to go to US East North Virginia and do exactly the same thing. So let's go in and launch an instance, Linux 2 AMI, T2 Micro, and again, we just come down and choose the IAM role, S3 read only, paste in our user data, and let's just go through and make sure that the security group we select has port 80 inbound from any source. And that's all we need to do there. So I've got those two. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I want to have an instance in a region that's closest to this other web server. And that's just going to be used for logging in via SSH and testing access to the web page from there. So we're going to go to US East 2. We're going to launch an instance, and we don't need to change any settings this time. Just make sure that it has a security group which allows SSH inbound. So I'm going to choose this one. I've got SSH inbound, so I can launch this EC2 instance. Okay, great. So we've got those running. Now let's go back and check our Sydney instance to make sure it's set up correctly. So I'm going to choose my running instance, come down to here, copy the public IP to my clipboard, and now in a web browser I'm going to put that in, and this is the result that I get. So it just tells me that the EC2 instance is located in AP Southeast 2A, and it's pulled that information from the metadata on the EC2 instance. It knows the availability zone. This is the name of the availability zone where that instance is located. So that's great, that's working. So let's go back to Route 53. So let's now create our records. So I'm going to create a record. I'm going to change this to latency. We don't need a record name because it's just going to resolve for dctlabs.com. It's going to be an A record because it's translating the domain name to an IP address. Now I need a value for the IP address of my instance. So let's go over, and I'm on North Virginia here, so I'll copy the public IP, paste this one in. Let's now choose US East and choose North Virginia. We're not going to do a health check, and I'm just going to call this US East 1 and create that record. So that's created the first record. Now we go back in and we do the same thing. So we create multiple records. Latency again, type A, pop back to the EC2 console, and I'm going to come over to Sydney and get the public IP of my instance. So let's grab that public IP, come back here, paste that in, and then this one is going to be AP-South. That should find AP Southeast 2. There it is, Sydney. And we'll just call this one AP Southeast 2 and create that record. So now we've got two records for dctlabs.com. Now one of the things we can do is use a utility to actually look these up from the command line. So let's see if our records have been set up properly. Now, by the way, sometimes it can take a little bit of time for these to propagate. So if you don't get your results instantly, you might have to just wait a little bit longer. So I'm on the command line, and there's a couple of utilities that I can use. Depending whether you're on Linux, Mac, or whether you're on Windows, you might use different utilities. So one of them is dig. So we can type in dig and then put in the name of the domain, dctlabs.com, and it gives us an answer here. And the answer comes back as this IP address. Now that's the IP address of my instance in Sydney. That's exactly what I expect because the latency-based routing is working. It's returning the IP of the instance that's closest to me. If you're on Windows, you can also use NSLookup, and it does the same thing. So you just type NSLookup and then dctlabs.com, and it's just a slightly different format, but it gives you the same answer here. So that looks great. Now the other way that we can look at this is obviously through a web browser. So let's go to a web browser. In a new tab, I'm going to type dctlabs.com, and then it comes back and says my instance is located in AP Southeast 2A. Now the next test to see if it's going to work to provide a different result for users that are closer, let's log into our EC2 instance in Ohio. So back in EC2, I'm going to head over to Ohio and just grab the IP address of my instance. I'm now logged into my instance in Ohio, and what I'm going to do is use the curl utility to try and connect to dctlabs.com. And curl actually returns the result, the web page that it's pulled from that particular endpoint on the page here. So we can see it says this Amazon EC2 instance is located in, and then we've got US East 1C. So because this particular EC2 instance is in Ohio, it has got the result for US East 1C because that's closer, so it's lower latency. So that's all worked very well. And all we need to do now to clean up is just go and terminate our instances. So make sure you go into each of the 3 regions and terminate each of your instances. Now, if you want to, you can delete those records from Route 53 as well.